Hello, pre-university long fiction students. Welcome back to school, to our new version of what school will be for the rest of the semester. Today I'm going to present you a lecture related to our study of Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, to remind you where we were before school was canceled on the 13th of March. We had read approximately half of the novel, and I had assigned you actually pages 141 to 183 to read, and then we didn't see one another again, and it's now almost a month later. And so we're going to try to pick up where we left off. Couple things I should mention to you. The first thing is that we will typically have a lecture module like this, a recorded lecture that I will post on Monday morning at the time of our class, and you can access it at your leisure. Then on Wednesday, we will typically have a video conference question and answer session from 9:30 to 10:15. As I mentioned in my message this morning, or I guess I sent it last week, those sessions, those question and answer sessions, are not obligatory for you to attend. You can attend them if you like. If you have questions to ask, that is your opportunity to ask them. So I would certainly encourage you to partake in those meetings, but it's not absolutely essential. And if there are no questions, I am not going to stand there and doing a song and dance routine to keep you entertained via Zoom. So that's something utilitarian. I will frequently give you question sets to work on when I post the lectures materials for Monday, and the expectation is that you will work on them at your own rhythm as well. You're welcome to collaborate with other classmates if you like, and again, if you have questions, certainly the video conference meetings would be the most appropriate place for those. I have also opened the forum on Leia for the class, so if you feel the need to pose questions to your classmates or to me, you can certainly do it there. The difference is that the video conference meetings will be in real time, and so that will perhaps be advantageous. If you have a further question, I can elaborate more as the case may be. If you do not have your book with you, I know that the college made kind of amends and tried to allow students to come in and pick up their books, things that were left in their lockers, but due to the unusual nature of what's happening, not everyone was in a position to be able to do that. So if you do not have your copy of As I Lay Dying with you, you should communicate that with me, and I will find a solution for you. So that's that. A couple other notes. One thing is that this week I had planned to have the the Zoom conference on Wednesday. However, I have been informed that Wednesday is now, for classroom purposes, a Friday schedule. So I do not have the freedom to give you the Zoom conference on Wednesday, April 8th. Similarly, next Monday will be April 13th. That's Easter Monday. And so the Zoom conference will take place on April 15th. That's a Wednesday. Also, again, due to the unexpected nature of what's been going on, the pandemic, the original due date for the novel, which was Wednesday, April 1st, has now been pushed back, and you can now turn in your term paper before 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, April 15th. So I know that many of you have been working on your essays over the time where we've been out of school. I've communicated with a number of you. If you are still waiting to get started on that, I would recommend that you do so as quickly as possible. If you're struggling with regards to source material, please let me know. The library, if you go through the library website, you have access to a great variety of electronic resources. If you are looking for something specific, you can talk to me about it, and I can try to find them for you. I have a large array of sources in PDF files that I could probably send you depending on what you're working on, if that's going to be helpful. I say that because most students tend to be satisfied with relatively weak internet sources, and rather than have that be the case, I would much prefer that you seek out good source material, and so that's what I would behoove you to do. Also, in looking at how much time we have left, it's most likely that we will not do a third novel. The original plan was to let you work on a third novel in small groups, either Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Michael Ondaatje's In the Skin of a Lion, Toni Morrison's Beloved, or Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. When I did the informal survey of the class, there were only 3 students who told me that they had purchased the books, and the bookstore is not going to be accessible. So if you did not purchase it before the campus closed, you will not be able to purchase it from them now. So that creates a slight complication. I was looking into PDF versions of the books to see if we could continue to do that, and there is possibility. The problem is time, because even though we're coming back today, April 6th, we lose our Wednesday class this week, and we lose our Monday class next week, and the schedule has not been extended for the semester. So the semester will end on May 15th, and so what that means is that probably for the graded work for the class, the only 2 assignments remaining for us to do will be the term essay, which, as I said, you should be working on already. And be aware that the points for each of the assignments will probably increase slightly because there are fewer assignments that are being turned in than was originally envisioned for the semester. So the term paper will be worth a little bit more. The written assignments that you've already done will be worth a little bit more, and the one remaining written assignment that you'll write between now and May 15th will also be worth more than had originally been anticipated. So once again, I'll work the same way I did for the first assignment from Pride and Prejudice, where I will give you a series of questions to work on at your own pace. And then we will come together, perhaps through the video conferencing format, or perhaps I will give a guided lecture, a video lecture, trying to lay out some of the major points of the questions being addressed that would put you in a position to answer them effectively. So my apologies. I think the semester is going to obviously be very, very different than we had initially anticipated it to be. We're going to lose a little bit of material. I've been told to focus on the competencies of the course, pre-university long fiction. So certainly the fact that we have the term paper as the main remaining assignment and one lingering written text gives me a good opportunity to still assess your acquisition of the required competencies for the class. So I don't feel that we're going to be, handcuffed unnecessarily. I mean, we lost probably we've lost 3 whole weeks of class time, and as I said, they're not being added on at the end. I think the general consensus is that we're going to try to get through the semester in as good a fashion as we can. So basically, you don't have that much work left to do. You need to finish reading As I Lay Dying. You need to think critically about that book, and so that's mostly the task that remains for us. So to refresh your memory where we left off many weeks ago, we have been following the saga of the Bundren family, a poor southern sharecropping family from Mississippi, from northeastern rural Mississippi, from Faulkner's famous Yaknapatawpha County. And this family is made up of the father, the patriarch Ance Bundren, the mother, Addie Bundren, who, if you remember, has died much earlier in the book, near the beginning of the book, and their children, Cash, Darl, Jewel, Dewey-Dell, and Vardaman. And after Addie's death, she had made it clear to her family members that she wished to be buried in Jefferson with her family, with her father and her mother, in the graveyard in Jefferson, which is about 40 miles away from where the Bundrens live. And so the Bundrens eventually set off on this odyssey, on this journey to bring Addie to Jefferson. Now, if you remember correctly, I'm going to recap some things that we talked about before the break because it's so long ago, I have difficulty imagining that you remember what we have already talked about. So the title of the book, As I Lay Dying, is taken from a quote from Agamemnon in Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, where Agamemnon is in Hades, in the underworld, and Odysseus, who descends to the underworld, meets up with him and discusses with him what it's like to be dead and what it's like to be in the underworld. And Agamemnon says, as I lay dying, the woman with the dog eyes refused to close my eyes for me. And this is the story of Agamemnon and his wife Clytemnestra. And when Agamemnon left to go to the Trojan War, he famously had to sacrifice the life of his daughter Iphigenia in order to get propitious winds for the Aegean soldiers to leave. And so he did that. And then he went to Troy, and the famous war lasted for 10 years. And he eventually came back. He came back with a young slave girl who was his prize, sort of, Cassandra. And this and the fact that he had sacrificed their daughter were two things that angered Clytemnestra greatly. Clytemnestra had taken up with another man during Agamemnon's absence named Aegisthus, and the two of them conspired upon Agamemnon's return to murder him. And so the quote is alluding precisely to that duplicity, the fact that the wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus, conspired to murder Agamemnon. And so we have, in the midst of this, Faulkner is invoking at the outset of his novel the story of Clytemnestra, the story of Agamemnon, this marital discord, duplicity, as well as the story of the Odyssey, where the quote is taken from, which is the story mainly of Odysseus's long, drawn-out return. As we mentioned at the beginning, the Odyssey and Faulkner's As I Lay Dying both take the form of something known as a nostos narrative. Nostos is a Greek word for return, and the type of narrative is quite famous, of going back to where you come from. Odysseus is trying to get back to Ithaca, the island where he is from, where his wife and his son are waiting for him, and he has been delayed due to capricious things related to the gods, and the god Poseidon is trying to delay him, and the goddess Athena is trying to assist him on his way. And so Odysseus's saga takes on this very delayed and stilted voyage of return, and eventually he gets back to Ithaca, and eventually he's able to reconcile the problems that he needs to address. But it's the whole story of the Odyssey is basically him getting home. The reason I mention that is because you should be able to see a relatively strong parallel with Faulkner's story. We've seen Addie's death, which happens in, as the story begins. Remember, we keep hearing the recurring sound of Cash sawing wood in each of the early chapters, and we gradually are introduced to various members of the Bundren family and some of the people that are their neighbors and people around them, and we start to understand certain aspects of their situation. And basically the scenario is that Addie is dying, and Cash is very meticulously working to make her coffin outside of her window. And so that sound that we hear again and again is the repetitive sound of Cash sawing wood and hammering boards and things like that to create a very meticulously, flawlessly formed casket for Addie for when she's dead. And then quickly she dies. If you remember back to that scene, you can go back and look at it if you need to. That passage of Addie's death was narrated by Darl, who is the second eldest son of the Bundren family. And we begin to become aware relatively early that Darl is rather special. He's referred to often as strange or queer by a lot of the other characters. He's unusual. He seems to have an extreme intelligence. When we notice his passages, the passages that he narrates, he's very articulate. He has a very large vocabulary, which would obviously be unusual for a sharecropper, a rural, probably uneducated sharecropper in the place and time where he lived. He seems to have a very poetic sensibility. He seems to be hyper aware and observant of the things going on around him. And also, he seems to have an extra sense, a prescience, or a deeper knowledge. And so he's the one who tells us, who narrates the chapter of Addie's death, even though he's not physically present. He narrates it with meticulous attention to detail, and he seems to be aware of secrets that other members of the family have. The most noticeable one that we see early on is we become aware that Dewey-Dell, the daughter of the Bundren family, is pregnant, and Darl is the only person besides her who knows this. And it's not exactly clear to us how he knows it or why he knows it, but Dewey-Dell is very clear that he knows it, and it's very clear from the way he narrates passages to us that he knows it. And so he has almost this extra, deeper insight. Some people ally him with kind of an artistic, creative sensibility, perhaps focusing him closely to the author, to William Faulkner. And so that's an important aspect. Now, as the story progresses, the Bundren family is trying to take Addie back to Jefferson. Their initial departure is delayed because Darl and Jewel have taken the wagon and the mules to deliver a load of lumber for Vernon Tull, and they're going to be paid $3 for this delivery, and it seems like it's a lot of money to them. It matters. And so they embark on this just at the time that Addie is on her deathbed. She's nearing death. And so while they are away, she dies. And then that problem is compounded by the fact that they have an accident with the wagon and they break a wheel. And so the wagon goes off the road, they're in a ditch, and they have a broken struts on their wheel. And so they have to come back, get a new wheel, repair it, and bring it back and go get the wagon and then bring it back again. So this puts them several days behind schedule for their departure. Now, of course, this is Mississippi in the summer. Addie has died, and as I mentioned, they don't have a proper gentleman to fix her. In other words, an undertaker or an embalmer, because typically when people die, their bodies are treated in a various series of chemical processes in order to sort of stop the biological decay of the corpse, because corpses are flesh and they basically decay. And so Addie has not been treated that way, and so she is basically just dead in this wooden box on the back of the wagon. And so as they start to go on their journey, this becomes a rather macabre aspect of the story. And in fact, the body starts to smell, and people that are following them or that are in their way, along the way, are kind of mortified by the smell and by the way that they're dealing with this situation of Addie's return to Jefferson. And so this long, drawn-out journey to get Addie back to Jefferson, which becomes basically something akin to an odyssey in its own right, is gradually takes on epic proportions. And one of the first things that happens is that there is a torrential rainstorm, a flood, basically, biblical proportioned flood. And this flood has the effect of washing out all of the bridges that the Bundrans will need to cross. They need to cross the river to get over to Jefferson, and the bridges along the way are washed out. And so they basically take their time trying to get across. They backtrack, and they are going here and there to try to see if they can make it across. And finally, they determine to attempt a crossing on a bridge that has been kind of submerged. It's the general frame of it is still there, but it's very treacherous, and they can't really just take the wagon across the bridge. And so what they do is they basically the three elder brothers, Cash, Darl, and Jewel, take the wagon with Addie's coffin. The father, Ants, the daughter, Dewey Dell, and the youngest son, Vardaman, who's quite young, are left off, and they wait on the side, and they cross on their own. And then the three older sons try to bring the coffin and the wagon and the mules across. Now, this is a delicate task, because they're in the middle of a flood. Water is flowing over the bridge, what remains of the bridge, and they're trying to kind of guide the wagon with the coffin across this passage. Jewel is on his horse. If you remember correctly, we have heard the story of Jewel and his late night endeavors to save money. That's my cat Ursula crying in the background, by the way. Hello, Ursula. And basically, Jewel has worked on his own accord at night to save up money to buy a horse, and he finally did it. And there was a whole bunch of familial conflict related to that with respect to Ants. This comes out in the process, in the departure for Addie's funeral journey, because Jewel wants to ride on his horse, and Ants resents that. He feels that all of them should be riding together on the wagon. Jewel eventually comes on the horse, and so he has the horse, and he has a rope that he has tied to the wagon, and Darl and Cash are on the wagon with the mules and with Addie's coffin, trying to bring it across the river. In the midst of this, a giant log rears up in the water and catches them, and basically, because of their sort of uneasiness, they're out of balance. They end up tipping over, and the mules go into the water. The wagon goes into the water. Cash falls out of the wagon. Addie's coffin goes into the water, and a whole series of episodes that are traumatic for them happen. Cash ends up badly injured. He breaks his leg, and so he gets finally to the other side of the river, and he's unconscious almost, and he's in extreme pain. He's being tended to. The coffin gets away, and eventually Jewel is the one who corrals the coffin and brings it back. And so they cross the river with a great sacrifice. And the biggest sacrifice is that the mules die. And so now they need to they need an alternate conveyance, because they no longer have the mules. Tull is offering to lend his mules. There are other proposals at work, but they have to find a new way to get Addie's coffin to Jefferson. And so now, as that happens, we're kind of coming up to the reading that you've done for this class. Previously, what I've been discussing for the last 10 minutes or so is related to the earlier passages in the book, the things that we read before we broke in mid-March. So when we get to the middle of the book, the passages, it's kind of an auspicious moment and a strange way that we had to read this for this week, because the chapters that we were to read include 3 rather awkward chapters. And the reason I say they're rather awkward is because they're somewhat achronological. If you remember when we were talking about the narrative form of this novel, the fact that the novel is narrated by a series of differing narrators, each of whom has their own voice, their own narrative perspective, their own biases, prejudices, habits, attitudes. And so gradually we start to become aware of who the characters are. We learn a little bit about Ants. We know that Ants is kind of a very lazy person. He's kind of tries to take advantage or gets as much out of everyone as he can and does as little as he can in exchange. We've seen Darl and his kind of weird poetic insights into things and his very fluid and flowing descriptions of things, often very visual, often kind of almost hallucinatory in a weird way, very, very beautifully constructed. We've seen Cash is meticulous. He's a carpenter. He makes lists. He's very direct and to the point. We've seen Jewel is extremely angry. We haven't seen much of him. He hasn't had too many chapters. We know that Dewey Dell is completely preoccupied by her pregnancy. And in fact, we start to see that the journey to Jefferson for her is precisely what the purpose it serves, is the possibility that she will be able to get an abortion. That's what she's hoping for. And then Vardaman, the young boy who we saw with the giant fish before Addie's death and his sort of traumatized state afterwards, is young. He seems strange. Probably he's a young boy who's trying to grapple with the fact that his mother just died, and he doesn't seem to be able to make sense of that. And then in the midst of this, we suddenly have 3 chapters in a row in the middle of the Bundren's journey to Jefferson, narrated in succession by Cora Tull, and then Addie, the dead matriarch of the family, and then lastly, Reverend Whitfield. And so those were 3 chapters at the heart of today's reading. And those chapters expose a great deal of important information. Those are what we might refer to as the metaphorical heart of the book, because the book is full of sort of secrets and alternative inspirations. We've seen that, right? We've seen in the whole story of the Bundrens and their journey to Jefferson, we've seen Ants talking about getting a new set of teeth when Addie dies. Well, God's will be done now, can get me them teeth. He wants to go to Jefferson to get teeth. We've seen Cash, who wants to buy a gramophone, an early record player. We see Dewey Dell wants her abortion, if she can get it. And we see Vardaman, who is kind of obsessed with a toy train that he saw in the window in town when he was there before, and he's hoping that perhaps he will be in a position to get the toy train. So we kind of have this rather strange overlay. And one of the key things in the book is that the book is very hybridized with respect to genre. And there's kind of a whole lot of almost burlesque humor. I'm not sure when you read it if you find it very funny. You probably don't find it very funny because the dialect and the idiom of the narrators can be difficult to follow. But if you look into it, there's a fair bit of humor, and it kind of has a slapstick quality at times. It's farcical in a certain way, and so we have this blending of genres in the novel that we'll look at in a little bit more depth soon. And so, in talking about the hybridized nature of the narrative here in Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, we also obviously have to consider the element of the epic. We've mentioned already that epic is the origin of the title. The journey that the Bundrins are going on has an epic quality to it. It's an odyssey. In Clenneth Brooks's seminal study on Faulkner, he entitles the chapter on As I Lay Dying, The Odyssey of the Bundrins. And obviously their efforts to get Addie home, as I mentioned earlier, are a typical Nostos narrative. And of course the epic poetry tends to be heroic in nature. It's the telling of great deeds of heroism. And so we can kind of see, you should be able to see something of the heroic in this story. There is behavior that may have a heroic tint to it. We can discuss as we go a little bit further into the book who those characters might be that are given an air of heroism about them. And certainly, people go to great lengths to get to realize Addie's dying wish to be buried with her family in Jefferson. And so, as I mentioned previously, there's another element that relates to epic, because one of the classic conventions of epic poetry is what's known as katabasis. Katabasis is Greek. It means the descent into the underworld. The Greek word kata is down and basis is go. And so katabasis is typically when the hero usually makes a descent to the underworld and he visits the land of the dead and is able to converse with them. As I said, the title of As I Lay Dying comes from that episode in the Odyssey where Odysseus is in the underworld and he encounters Agamemnon. You see it in the Aeneid. You see it in a number of other important epic poems. Now here we don't have per se the exact descent to the underworld, but we do have is that in the middle of the narrative, while the Bundrin family is trying to bring Addie back to Jefferson to have her buried, suddenly the chronology of the narrative is interrupted, and we have 3 chapters that seem rather out of place, narrated in succession by Cora, Addie, and Whitfield. And these chapters, coming when they do, suggest something of an intrusion of the voice of the dead. And of course, this chapter in the middle one, this is the only narrative chapter given to Addie in the book, and it's probably one of the most important narrated pieces in the book, because the story is very much about her. And so what we learn there is a revelation of numerous issues. One of the term paper topics that I gave related to that, I'm going to call that up here. Well over halfway through William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, Addie Bundrin, who died early in the book, is given the narrative voice of one of the story's chapters. This intrusion of the deceased matriarch's voice into the flow of the account of her family's effort to bring her back to Jefferson for her burial is jarring. Give a close reading of Addie's monologue. Pay particular attention to her justifications for her actions and her distrust of words. What is Faulkner trying to get at here? Take note also of the perspective presented in the chapters that surround Addie's monologue. Why is the placement of these chapters significant? So I hope you have read through these chapters. And of course, if you haven't, there's a spoiler alert here. But if you're not reading, you're not reading, and there's not very much I can do about it. You'll be deprived of some of the joy of the book, although you may feel you may gain that by not having to read it, which is entirely up to you. Anyways, when you have to write about it, that's a whole other story, of course. But what we do learn, these chapters are quite interesting for a number of reasons. Cora, we have seen previously in the book, is very much a moralistic figure. We know that she's very Christian, and we know that she has a little bit of an attitude, let's say. We might call it a holier than thou attitude, that she lords her Christianity over other people. And certainly in her chapter that intrudes here, we find very much that Cora is judging Addie as not being religious enough. And of course, there's a very important story at the heart of this that we'll eventually unearth. But this is on page 166 when Cora narrates, and she says, "One day we were talking. She had never been pure religious. Even after that summer at the camp meeting when Brother Whitfield wrestled with her spirit, singled her out and strove with the vanity in her mortal heart. And I said to her many a time, God gave you children to comfort your hard human lot and for a token of his own suffering and love. For in love you conceived and bore them." Okay? And she kind of tells Addie, she's talking about Addie's connection to Brother Whitfield. Whitfield is the priest. We've seen him earlier in the book because he is the one who crossed the river in order to come and bless Addie, the religious extreme unction, the last rite of the church where you are blessed before you die. And it's kind of, the role that a holy man will play. Whitfield is a curious character. He has the chapter after Addie's, and we'll certainly have a chance to look at him in short order. But Cora is talking a little bit about Addie and her role as a mother. That's another topic actually that has been presented to you all for the term paper topics. I'll read that one as well. The female characters in William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying are repeatedly associated with the earth. Fecundity and motherhood are presented with recurring metaphors related to farming. Examine the novel's use of this pattern of imagery. What is the comment that the author is making here? What is the nature of the novel's treatment of the theme of motherhood? The reason I'm bringing that up right now is because there are three prominent female characters in the novel. There are more, but the three most important ones are obviously Addie, Dewey Dell, and Cora. And Cora here has made a comment to Addie about her role as a mother. And basically, the context of the book is very much that these women, poor rural women, are thrust upon these responsibilities as being kind of the person in charge of the household, in the sense the cooking and cleaning and the traditional interior household chores, and also the role of mother, nurturing, giving birth and nurturing the children. And this is almost the most prominent role. Once again, the reason I'm highlighting this here is because when we get to Addie's monologue, we learn a number of things about her. And most importantly, what we learn is her sort of abnegation, really, of her role as a mother. She has been forced into this role, and it's not entirely clear that she is happy about it. So the first thing we find out about her is that she was a school teacher, and she talks about her experiences as a school teacher and her anxiety and disdain for the students. I don't know when you read that. As a teacher myself, it always I find it rather curious, because she really despises her students, and she kind of resents their imposition on her. So we see her in her kind of recollecting. Keep in mind, right, this is page 169. The chapter here is 169 to 176. You're pretty much in the middle of the book. Addie's been dead since, around page 40. So her voice, all of a sudden coming from beyond the grave, is very much an intrusion. And of course, the other thing about it is that we've seen her lying in the bed. We've seen the people sort of fussing over her. We've seen the various members of the family and their relationships to her, but we haven't really seen who she is until this moment. And when we do get to see her, her character is perhaps a little bit shocking to us. Again, I don't know how you were expecting her to be, because she's been this mute, dying, frail form in the bed, and then she's been this rotting corpse in the coffin for the whole book. And suddenly she's now kind of a vital woman talking about her experiences in life. And so that kind of is very abrupt. And so our image of Addie the school teacher is rather vividly portrayed to us, and her disdain for the students, which is, of course, predates her role as a mother. One of the key situations in this novel is that the social context for women is extremely limited. And you see all of the women, all of the female characters in the book are kind of have a burden. They carry a burden of expectation upon them, and there's a none too subtle disdain that they have for, they resent sort of their place in society. And you certainly see it from Addie. We've seen it previously from Cora in a certain place. We've seen it from Rachel as well. And we'll see it from a couple others as we move on. So this is on page 169 where Addie's monologue begins. In the afternoon when school was out and the last one had left with his dirty little snuffling nose, instead of going home, I would go down the hill to the spring where I could be quiet and hate them. It would be quiet there then, and the water bubbling up and away, and the sun slanting quiet in the trees, and the quiet smelling of damp and rotting leaves and new earth, especially in the early spring, for it was worst then. I could just remember how my father used to say that the reason for living was to get ready to stay dead a long time. And when I would have to look at them day after day, each with his or her secret and selfish thought, and blood strange to each other blood, and strange to mine, and think that this seemed to be the only way I could ever get ready to stay dead. I would hate my father for having ever planted me. I would look forward to the times when they faltered so I could whip them. When the switch fell, I could feel it upon my flesh. When it welted and ridged, it was my blood that ran, and I would think with each blow of the switch, now you are aware of me. Now I am something in your secret and selfish life, who have marked your blood with my own forever and ever. That's a rather brutal passage. She's talking about beating the children that she's in charge of to teach. Now, of course, that was another time and place. That was something that happened actually in my lifetime. I've seen teachers beat students when I was a student, not when I was a teacher, mind you. And so, that is part of the past, happily, but it happened. Now, the key thing here is that Addie seems to take kind of a weird, almost a sadomasochistic glee that she's enjoying the suffering of the students. And of course, in light of that passage I just pointed out to you, one of the questions, there's a whole lot of imagery of fertility and the earth. And women are these kind of earth mothers, in a sense, that there's this extended metaphor of planting. You see the quiet smelling of damp and rotting leaves and the new earth. We've seen Dewey Dell connected to similar images in the past. Now, of course, there's a curious parallel here because Addie is dead, and the whole endeavor that the Bundrans are undertaking is precisely to plant her body in the soil in the form of a cemetery. And so that weird image of kind of this fertility of the ground and planting and farming metaphors take on a very curious place. Now, as I said, she's talking about being on her own. There's the image of the spring. The spring is a very Freudian image, water coming out of the earth. It's another one associated with fertility. And also she's going back to her father. And as that passage ends, she immediately says, and so I took ants. So she's jumped from her role as a teacher and her resentment at being a teacher to taking ants. Notice the phrasing, and so I took ants. It's almost like a resultative, right? This is the reason why I did it. Now, what she's been talking about in this previous passage, if you go to look at it, is something of kind of a nascent sexual desire. She's talking about these urges in the spring, and springtime is the cycle. If we think of the cycle of the seasons and the cycle of life, springtime is the time when the animals come out from hibernation and is when sexuality kind of comes into its fluorescence. And then, so she says here, where does she say it? But she's talking about going down to the spring, and then later on she says that it was worst in the spring. And so, of course, this seasonal, especially in the early spring, for it was worst then. She's talking about the rotting of the leaves, but she's also talking about this fertility. And so she's a young woman. She's working as a teacher, and she kind of sees her plight in a limited way. And so I took ants, and we learned that ants had been coming around, sort of stalking her a little bit. I mean, he's been going out of his way, driving 4 miles out of his way to go by the schoolhouse and look at her. And then she finally starts to talk to him and find out a little bit about him. This is on page 171. If you got any woman folks, why in the world don't they make you get your hair cut? I ain't got none, he said. Then he said, suddenly driving his eyes at me like two hounds in a strange yard, that's what I come to see you about. And make you hold your shoulders up, I said. You haven't got any, but you've got a house. They tell me you've got a house and a good farm, and you live there alone, doing for yourself, do you? He just looked at me, turning his hat in his hands. A new house, I said. Are you going to get married? And he said again, holding his eyes to mine, that's what I come to see you about. And so this is a pretty awkward situation, because what's happened is she's caught him, as I said, stalking her, driving by repeatedly and kind of ogling her, looking at her from afar. And finally she encounters him, and they have this rather stilted conversation, and he reveals his intention that he would like to marry her. Now, we already know a fair bit about ants. We know that he's very lazy. We know that he's opportunistic. He takes advantage of other people. We don't really know too much about Addie. We've seen her, if you remember, well, we've seen her on her deathbed, obviously, but you couldn't get a very strong sense of who she was as a character. But we have seen her in one other episode in relative detail, which is when the story of Jules' endeavor to buy the horse, when he was going to work for Clem Snopes in the evening, and he would come back all tired. And we saw that Addie was kind of doting over him, and she was very, very sort of anxious and nervous, and forced some of the brothers and sisters to pick up the workload that Jewel was unable to do. Now, in the previous chapter, we've seen Cora talking about Addie's relationship to Jewel, and she starts to imply that Addie's relationship to Jewel is unusual. And of course, in this chapter, the bombshell of the novel finally comes out for us, and many of the things that have been sort of possibly inferred are clarified. And the key thing here is that Jewel is illegitimate. Addie has had an affair with Reverend Whitfield, and he is the father of Jewel. And so he is not Ance's legitimate son. Now, this is kind of shocking for a number of reasons. We've seen, as I mentioned, ironically, Cora in the previous chapter had made mention of it. Now, Cora tends to not be very insightful. She thinks she knows a lot more than she does, but she's often quite wrong. She's quite wrong about Darl. She's quite wrong about Jewel. She's quite wrong about a lot of people. She's wrong about Addie too, probably, although she's judgmental. And so she says, one day while we were talking, she had never been pure religious, not even after that summer at the camp meeting when Brother Whitfield wrestled with her spirit, singled her out, and strove with the vanity in her moral heart. And I said to her many a time, God gave you children to comfort your hard human lot, and for a token of his own suffering and love, for in love you conceived and bore them. Now that line, once we know a few pages later what has actually gone on, becomes kind of curiously ironic, that Brother Whitfield was wrestling with her spirit out at the summer at the camp meeting. Now, Brother Whitfield and Addie did have an illicit relationship, and we see that referred to quite vividly in a little bit later here. But what basically ends up happening is that Addie's affair with Brother Whitfield is a product of her resentment for her role, the role she's been cast in as mother. And so Addie shares with us her feeling about taking ants. And of course, there's an element of her partnership with ants that's sort of resignation. And so I took ants. So I took ants, right? This is repeated on 170 and 171. And so I took ants. It's kind of like this result, like I didn't know of anything else I could do. I wasn't going to stay a teacher because I hated it. And this sexual desire that's associated with the natural world, right? That's associated with those recurring images of farming and animals. In the early spring, it was worse. Sometimes I thought that I could not bear it, lying in bed at night with the wild geese going north and their honking coming faint and high and wild out of the wild darkness. And during the day, it would seem as though I couldn't wait for the last one to go so I could go down to the spring. And so when I looked up that day and saw Ant standing there in his Sunday clothes, turning his hat around in his hands, okay? So this is kind of the connection, right? This physical desire, this growing sexual desire on Addie's part, and her acceptance of Ants. Now, Ants is kind of not she didn't win the lottery in picking him as a partner, but it's kind of like she didn't have any other choice. If you remember going back to Charlotte Lucas, in Pride and Prejudice, where her circumstances were becoming more and more constraining, and the idea when Mr. Collins proposes to her is that, well, this is the best I'm possibly going to get, so I'm going to take it. And so Addie's phrasing, "so I took ants," is sort of a justification. This is the reason why she ended up with ants. And when I knew that I had cash, I knew that living was terrible and that this was the answer to it. That was when I learned that words are no good, that words do not even fit with what they're trying to say at. When he was born, I knew that motherhood was invented for someone who had to have a word for it, because the ones that had the children didn't care whether there was a word for it or not. I knew that fear was invented by someone who had never had the fear, pride who never had the pride. I knew that it had been, not that they had dirty noses, but that we had had to use one another by words like spiders dangling in their mouths from a beam, swinging and twisting and never touching. And that only through the blows of the switch could my blood and their blood flow as one stream. I knew that it had been, not that my aloneness had been violated over and over every day, but that it had never been violated until cash came, not even by ants in the nights. There you see a pretty strong statement. She alludes to her attitude about words, which is one of the key elements of the monologue, her distrust for words. And what she's talking about is people using words to kind of get other things, okay? And she's talking about words for love, right? And precisely what is love? And this is where she feels like she's been tricked. That what she got wasn't what she expected to get. And one of the things that she was not expecting to get was this role of mother. So I took ants, and when I knew that I had cash, I knew that living was terrible and that this was the answer to it. Okay? And we're talking about motherhood, being a mother. She has a child. Presumably this is a wonderful moment. You have a child, you have this small being who is, needs you and is of you, but she seems to feel like it's something else. And she talks about violation, and what's being violated is her aloneness. So she kind of appreciated being alone, and suddenly Ants' presence is an intrusion on that. And so, and then I found out I had Darl. At first I would not believe it. Then I believed I would kill Ants. It was as though he had tricked me, hidden within a word like within a paper screen, and struck me in the back through it. But then I realized that I had been tricked by words older than ants or love, and that the same word had tricked Ants too, and that my revenge would be that he would never know I was taking revenge. That's the nature of her revenge. And of course, we know that she basically disavows Ants at this point. And she basically says, right afterwards, he did not know that he was dead then. Okay? He's not dead, literally dead, but to her, metaphorically, he's dead. And she starts talking about this idea of shape and of words and her status as a mother. And she kind of, all of it becomes mixed up in her head, and she doesn't she doesn't appreciate it anymore. She doesn't want to be part of what she is. And so, and so when Cora Tell would tell me I was not a true mother, I would think how words go straight up in a thin line, quick and harmless, and how terribly doing goes along the earth, clinging to it, so that after a while the two lines are too far apart for the same person to straddle from one to another, and that sin and love and fear are just sounds that people who have never sinned, nor loved, nor feared have for what they never had and cannot have until they forget the words, like Cora, who could never even cook. That passage there is referring to the previous chapter where Cora has been talking to her and talking about the words for sin and love and who we can judge, and a very kind of a chapter dedicated a lot to religious ideas. And her and Addie, Cora and Addie, are kind of at cross purposes. They don't see things the same way, and Cora is very, very judgmental. It's interesting because she takes it upon herself. She's talking about who can judge and that it's only God's place to judge. And ironically, she's using that as a way of judging. So that's basically what happens leading up to this. And then we move quickly into her discussion of her liaison with Whitfield. I believed that I had found it. I believed that the reason was the duty to the alive, to the terrible blood, the red, bitter flood boiling through the land. I would think of sin as I would think of the clothes we both wore in the world's face, of the circumspection necessary, because he was he and I was I, the sin the more utter and terrible, since he was the instrument ordained by God who created the sin to sanctify that sin he had created. While I waited for him in the woods, waiting for him before he saw me, I would think of him as dressed in sin. I would think of him as thinking of me as dressed also in sin, he the more beautiful, since the garment which he had exchanged for his sin was sanctified. I would think of the sin as garments which we would remove in order to shape and coerce the terrible blood to the forlorn echo of the dead word high in the air. Then I would lay with ants again. I would not lie to him, I just refused, just as I refused my breast to cast Chandarl after their time was up, hearing the dark land talking the voiceless speech. Very eloquent passage. She's talking about an affair with a man of God. She's talking about them taking off their clothes, and that the sin that they're engaged in is even more sinful because he's supposed to be a holy man. He's not supposed to sin. And so the whole image of their clothing and their sort of disavowal of what they're supposed to do is loaded there. And then, of course, the affair quickly comes to an end. She ends up knowing that she's pregnant with Jewel, but she does not continue her affair with Whitfield. And then, of course, the passage ends here. She goes back and she has this very complicated rationale in her mind about she had Cash and Darl with ants, and then she kind of imagined that he was dead. And then she has Jewel through this illicit affair with Whitfield. And then she says she has the other children kind of as this weird calculation of undoing what she did with Whitfield. I gave Ants Dewey-Dell to negative Jewel, then I gave him Vardaman to replace the child I had robbed him of, and now he has 3 children that are his and not mine. And then I could get ready to die. One day I was talking to Cora. She prayed for me because she believed I was blind to sin, wanting me to kneel and pray too, because people to whom sin is just a matter of words, to them salvation is just words too. And that's the ending of her passage. And she's again referring to that chapter that precedes it with Cora. And then the chapter here is followed by the chapter with Whitfield. And as I said, we've seen Whitfield previously when he showed up, when he crossed the bridge and came to put a blessing on the house. And we saw him very briefly coming in and saying, God, God bless this house. And now we get the opportunity to see hear his story, the chapter that he narrates. And so, as I said, Addie's chapter is followed by a brief chapter narrated by Reverend Whitfield. Whitfield is an interesting figure because he's based on a historical character. The person's name was George Whitefield, written with an E, but pronounced Whitfield, who was an English religious man who eventually came to the United States, and he was famous for these revival tent meetings, a very kind of evangelical, very ostentatious speaker. And supposedly he was quite famous. I believe Benjamin Franklin had once said, if you ever go to see Whitfield speak, make sure you leave your money at home because he's going to end up with all of it. He's a very convincing speaker. And so he was also in favor of the legalization of slavery at a time when that was a contentious issue. So Faulkner is using the name to kind of conjure certain things. And of course, Whitfield in the novel is a very curious character. If you remember, when we did see him before he shows up and blesses the home, in his chapter here, we understand what's motivating him. He's going to see Addie, but he's motivated by something that might not be necessarily so noble. He's worried that basically because Addie is on her deathbed, she may confess to her sin. The idea of sinning being that, if you confess your sin, you can go with a clean conscience. And when you're going to die, perhaps if you're going with a sin on your head that you never acknowledge, that might be a bad thing. So when they told me she was dying, all that night I wrestled with Satan and I emerged victorious. I woke to the enormity of my sin. I saw the true light at last and fell on my knees and confessed to God and asked his guidance and received it. Rise, he said, repair to that home in which you have put a living lie among those people with whom you have outraged my word. Confess your sin aloud. It is for them, for that deceived husband to forgive you, not I. So I went. I heard that Tull's bridge was gone. I said, thanks, O Lord, O mighty ruler of all. For by those dangers and difficulties which I had to surmount, I saw that he had not abandoned me, that my reception again into his holy peace and love would be the sweeter for it. Okay? And so he basically goes to great lengths to get there. And then what's interesting is on his way there, he is going over what he's going to say to ants. He's struggling to get across the water, and that he believes that God is presenting a challenge to him. I knew then that forgiveness was mine, the flood, the danger behind. And as I rode on across the firm earth again, and the scene of my Gethsemane drew closer and closer, I framed the words which I would use. I would enter the house. I would stop her before she had spoken. I would say to her husband, Ants, I have sinned. Do with me as you will. Okay. Now, what ends up happening is Addie dies before he gets there. Then I reached Tull's house. His youngest girl came out and called to me as I was passing. She told me that she was already dead. I have sinned, O Lord. Thou knowest the extent of my remorse and the will of my spirit. But he is merciful. He will accept the will for the deed. Who knew that when I framed the words of my confession, it was to ants I spoke them, even though he was not there? It's kind of a curious one. He's saying that his confession that he made to himself while he was riding on his horse trying to cross the flooded river is the same as if he had actually confessed to ants, and that he considers himself to be vindicated, right? And he goes on to talk about how wonderful the Lord is, and basically then we have the last part of his chapter where he mentions his arrival. I entered the House of Bereavement, the lowly dwelling where another erring mortal lay, while her soul faced the awful and irrevocable judgment. Peace to her ashes. God's grace upon this house, I said. Him and Cora both are judging Addie because she never confessed her sin, and Cora is judging her in the previous chapter because she feels that she's putting herself in too high of a place. And so you have this kind of Christian sanctimoniousness among these two characters with Addie. And Addie's clearly not a very religious person, but there might be a comment being made on Faulkner's behalf about what the true value system there should be. So that brings us through these crucial central chapters to the book. As I said, the three chapters narrated by Cora, Addie, and Whitfield that really make up the heart of the book. And we learn about Addie's duplicity. We learn about her affair with Whitfield. And now we're going to kind of jump cut back to the story of the Bundrans taking Addie to the cemetery. And if you remember, the wagon had fallen, and there's all sorts of complicating episodes that will continue to deter them from making their way to Jefferson. And so that's basically the rest of the book that remains for us. Let me find my pages here, and I will give you all your reading. I believe 183. So you should read, actually probably you should just finish the book, because we do not have class on Wednesday because it is a Monday session, and we do not have class on Monday of next week because it is Easter Monday. And so in light of those facts, I will just say finish reading the book. So that would be read to page 261, from page 183 to 261. We will have a lecture to finish up the discussion of the book next week. I will post on Wednesday some question sets and written work for you to do related to that. And we will also have a Zoom class format, I believe at 9:30 on next Wednesday. So if you have any questions relating to the term paper assignment, remember that the term paper due date has been extended. It is now due before midnight on April 15th. And so you can submit the paper via Mio. You can just send it. Please send it as a Word document, a Microsoft Word attached document to your email. Please do not send PDFs, and please do not send screenshots and things like that. A Word attached file would be the preferred mode of transmission, and it needs to be in my possession, in my inbox, by 11:59 p.m. on April 15th. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me via Mio. The forum, as I said previously, has been opened up, so if you would like to ask questions there, if you'd like to ask questions of your classmates or of me, feel free to do so there. And that's basically it for now. So have a nice day.